Fellow chess players, well done on making your first steps at improving your chess. Today, we're going to break down 10 years of my chess knowledge in just 30 minutes. Of course, that's impossible, but we are going to break down the opening, middle game, and end game, so you have some idea of what's going on in this vast game of chess. Now, I want to start with a story. I always used to fall for this trap when I was younger. In response to e4, I always used to play e5, which, by the way, is a good move. But when the opponent played the move queen h5, here I started to panic a little bit. Okay, I defended my pawn, and then they played this move bishop c4, and I could never figure out for the life of me what's going on, and I fell for this trap. I kid you not. I kid you not, 5 or more times. The same trap. So I guess I wasn't a very fast learner, but I kept getting checkmated the same way. So eventually I learned, okay, you play g6, push the queen away, play knight f6, bishop g7, knight d4, and kick this queen away and you have a good position. But I never knew this starting off. And before my under 12 state tournament, which I did end up winning, my next struggle arose. There were certain openings that led to some middle games, which I just had no idea what is my plan. Like, okay, I've got all my pieces out, I've got them all developed. What do I do from here? Well, that's a really good question, and it's actually a little complex, but I will break it down for you in this video. Also, the endgame. The endgame is the most complex part of chess, and if you don't know that yet, that means you're probably not good enough to know that yet, where you have so little pieces, but so many possibilities, and you just don't know what's going on. But I'm going to guide you through it today. Let's start with the opening. In the opening, it's very simple. You only have 3 rules to follow. Step number 1, take the center with your pawns. Let's say your opponent does absolutely nothing, just so I can demonstrate the point. Let's say they play a move like a5. Of course, they won't do this in a game, but let me demonstrate the point. Now, you play the move d4. You've taken the full center with your pawns, and this is what you're going to do against any move that they do, which does nothing. You put the knight out, so you bring all your pieces out, starting with the knight and then the bishops. You bring your other knight out, and let's say they continue to do nothing. You bring your bishop out, you bring your other bishop out. Now we play the special move castles, which I'm sure most of you know about, but if you don't know about it, I'm suggesting you watch the special masterclass I did for schools, where I went through how all the pieces move and all the special moves. So castles is what we play, and once they keep moving, let's say they keep doing nothing, you bring the queen into the game, then you bring the rooks into the center, and now you have got every single piece where you want it. Your pawns are controlling the center, your knights are in behind controlling the pawns and the squares in front of the pawns. The bishops have a really nice diagonal attacking the enemy. The queen is safely tucked behind the army, and the rooks are in support, and the king is safe. This is what you want out of the opening. Now let's take a more practical example. So to demonstrate the opening, I'm going to take you through one of the most famous games in chess history ever. Paul Morphy vs Duke Carl. Morphy starts with the move e4. His opponent responds with e5. So far so good, so far so standard. Now, Morphy plays the move knight f3. And if you don't know anything about Paul Morphy, he's kind of seen as the Isaac Newton of chess, where he follows all the basic principles very, very well, and he's kind of pioneered the game. So he's simply developing a knight to attack the pawn in the center, which is perfectly reasonable by chess principles. They play the move d6. It isn't bad, it's called the Philidor defense, but what it does is, it doesn't develop a piece, and it blocks in this bishop, so this bishop will be a bit passive later on in the game. Morphy responds with the move d4, taking the full center, again playing all by the chess principles. What were they? Take the center, develop your pieces, and bring your king to safety. His opponent plays bishop to g4 and is already going wrong. Now, why is he going wrong? Well, it doesn't seem like a bad move on the surface because he's developed a piece. But remember, chess is 50% strategy and 50% tactics, and there's a tactic here. Now, Morphy takes the pawn. Why does he take the pawn? If his opponent were to take back, Morphy would simply trade the queen and take the pawn. And if you're wondering why couldn't he just take the pawn immediately, well, his queen would be hanging, and actually this would just be checkmate, so this would be really bad. So he would trade the queen first and then take the pawn. So his opponent couldn't do that. He had to actually give up the bishop first. So he gave up the bishop, Morphy took back with the queen, he took back with the pawn. And already you're about to see why this opening has been a disaster for the opponent. Morphy plays the move bishop to c4, and if you remember from the start of this video, this is something I fell for a lot. the 4-move checkmate. I guess unluckily for Morphe, his opponent wasn't as bad as me when I was starting chess, and he actually defended the threat. So he played knight f6, defending this threat. Now, Morphe plays the move queen b3, attacking the pawn again and attacking this pawn again. So this is getting really bad for the opponent. He plays queen e7. Now, Morphe could play the move queen takes b7, but Morphe is no regular person, and he follows the chess principles. Chess principles tell us to get all of our pieces active. And you might be thinking, why don't you just take? Well, if he took, his opponent would give him a check here. He would take, he would be up a pawn. But this is nothing special actually. If you block with the knight already, I can take, and there's no advantage here for the white pieces. So Morphe, instead of this, just develops a piece, brings his knight out, and his opponent is already going wrong here. He plays c6, not a terrible move, but again, what doesn't it do? It doesn't develop a piece. So what Morphe does is he pins the knight to the queen and is ready to either long castle or short castle. His opponent doesn't again develop a piece, and this is why it's so crucial to develop pieces. Now Morphe, since he has so many pieces in the attack, there's always some type of tactic that gives, and he plays knight takes b5, c takes b5, and bishop takes b5. Now, if you're a little more advanced in chess, you might be thinking, wait a second, aren't we down 1 point of material? Well, we are. But there's something in chess that has more practical value than just counting material based on what it's worth. For example, let's say I had a really nice house and a really nice car, a Ferrari let's say, but that house and car I was never allowed to sit in, or go inside, or even go in the vicinity of. How much would it really be worth? Well, in this case, this rook is kind of like the house, and this bishop is kind of like the car. They're not playing in the game, whereas Morphe's pieces are all about to be playing. The bishop's playing, both bishops are playing, the queen is playing, the rooks are about to be playing. So this is what we count in chess. You always want to make sure that all your pieces are playing in the game, and this is why rule number 2 is very important. Develop all your pieces. Now we play the move castle. Why do we castle? Another piece is in the game, and of course our king is very safe. Now after this, his opponent continues to defend, but he's defending with very limited resources. Remember, his house and Ferrari are still at home doing absolutely nothing. We can't visit them. They're not playing in the game. Now Morphe plays the incredible move rook takes d7. Now his opponent takes back, and now Morphe plays the move rook d1, attacking this rook further, and it can't capture us because it's pinned to the king. This knight is pinned to the queen, and the Ferrari and house just can't move. So Morphe is ahead in this game despite being 3 points of material down. Now after queen e6, he's looking for a queen trade, but does Morphe want to trade the queens? No, he doesn't. When you're in the attack, you don't want to trade material. You want to keep as much material on the board as you can. He simply takes the rook, and once knight takes, he plays the brilliant move in this position. So he sacrifices the queen, queen b8, to deliver the most brutal and famous checkmate in chess history. Rook d8 is mate. And remember, the queen can't guard the king, the knight can't, and of course, the Ferrari and the house can't do anything. And in our case, our king is very safe. So we've won the game despite being down so much in material. And this is the beauty of the game of chess. But you might be thinking, okay, this was really easy. His opponent didn't play that good. Now, what if we didn't have something clear to beat our opponent with straight away? What if we didn't have tactics like bishop c4 and queen b3? What would we do then? Well, that's when the middle game comes into play. It's time to talk about the middle game. To talk about the middle game, we're going to discuss 2 key games. Game number 1 is a game between Ikiba Rubinstein and George Solway, both chess masters, and let's see how this game went. So it starts off with a random opening. I don't want to go through the opening as it's not our concern. So as the game proceeds, both players are following all of the chess principles. They're getting ready to castle and all of their pieces are coming out. But as you can see, now in this position, it's not very clear what we should do. Now, we could get the bishop out, that would follow chess principles, but in this case, it might hang the pawn on b2, so we have to be really careful. In this game, he played an incredible move, and he did this with a simple thing I like to call the 5-question rule. Now, to truly understand the middle game, there's 5 questions I like to ask. Question number 1 is there any tactical opportunities in the position? And that goes for yourself and your opponent. So in this position, you would ask yourself, is there anything that I can do tactically to win the game immediately? And the answer you would quickly come to is no. Not in this position. We don't have a fork, we don't have a double attack, we don't have an advanced tactic to win any material. Question number 2 is, what's my opponent's plan? Now, this one's a bit of a tough one, especially for newer players, where their opponent's plan is not that clear. For example, in this position, it's not clear at all what black wants to do. They do want a castle, they do want to bring this bishop out, but that's about it. There's nothing too advanced here. Now, question number 3 is where we get to the plan in this specific position. It's, what is my opponent's weaknesses? And you might be thinking, what do you mean by weaknesses? Well, in chess, weaknesses are defined by something you can exploit. For example, in this position, black has what we called hanging pawns. When there's two pawns like this together, we call them hanging. Not because they are hanging, it's because that's just the name we give them. It's a weird thing, chess has weird rules, en passant castle. This is another name for something in chess. Now, with hanging pawns, the hanging pawn that's the weakest is the one that's backwards. This c6 pawn is really weak because no other pawn defends this pawn. So what we can do is normally pile up on this pawn with moves like rook c8 and bishop e3, and also control the square in front of the pawn. So for example, a move like knight a4 would be really good to control the c5 square. If this pawn can't move, we can pile up further on the pawn and eventually win it. So that is our plan. So guess what move the infamous Akiba Rubinstein played? That's right, you guessed it, it's knight a4, and he's following the plan. Bishop comes to e3, rook comes to c1, and he wants to pile up on this pawn and the weak square in front of the pawn. So his opponent responded by moving the queen. Of course, he doesn't blunder the queen. His opponent also went through the checklist and said, oh, rule number 1, tactical opportunities, I'm not giving up my queen. So he played bishop e3, again controlling the square. Now he played rook c1, again controlling the square, and you can see how the middle game plan comes from understanding those 5 questions and understanding what you really have to do in this position. Now his opponent developed the bishop, he simply played f3. Now this is a multi-purpose move. For 1, it sends the bishop backwards, but for 2, he has a deeper plan. He wants to bring the rook to f2, push this pawn eventually, and bring this rook to c2, so it can further target the pawn. So you can see these players, all their moves are not just one move threats, they all interlock as part of a larger plan. So let's keep going through the game. He puts the bishop on c5 and the idea is very simple. He wants to trade off his opponent's bishop so he can land his knight on c5. And what will that accomplish? Well, in chess you really want to know what pieces you want to trade. This bishop is black's good bishop. Well, why is it their good bishop? Well, it controls the c5 square, and we want to take away as much control from that c5 square as possible from the black pieces. So we trade the bishop. First he plays rook f2, he's not in a hurry. Then he trades the bishop, and now he plays queen d4, again controlling the square. And now here is the 4th question. You might be like, he introduced 5 questions but he only gave us 3. Well, this is the 4th. Your 4th question is, what is my worst placed piece and how can I improve it? Now in this position, I want you to really think about it. What do you think your worst placed piece is? Now if you said the rook or the bishop, you're correct. These pieces are not in the game and you want to get in the game playing moves like e3, rook c2, and with the bishop it's really bad. You can't bring it here, it will lose the bishop. If you play a move like f4, this bishop will still stare at absolutely nothing as you can't take the pawn because it will recapture. So the bishop actually has to go back to go forward. And this is a concept of chess of taking 2 steps backwards to take 3 steps forwards. Also, it's a concept in life as well. So you want to play the move bishop f1. So eventually you can play e3, unveil an attack on the queen, and also bring the rook to c2. If you're confused by the arrows, I will redo them. Bishop f1, e3, rook c2. Very simple plan. So he plays the move bishop f1 and he goes through the 4th question of the checklist. Now he plays the move e3. And he plays knight c5. Very simply puts the knight to c5, controlling the square, and as you can see, this pawn is still a weakness. Now he trades, he takes with the rook. Now his plan is very simple. Queen c3, rook c2, pile up on the pawn. So this move isn't very good, and it takes me to the 5th question of the middle game checklist. Are there any pawn breaks in the position? Yes, there is. b4. Now, when all your pieces are perfectly placed, the queen is on d4, the rooks are ideally placed, the bishop is doing well on this diagonal, you want to try and break the game open. And you break the game open by removing pawns and making sure that your pieces can activate squares they couldn't activate before. And this move b4 is really good because it aims to play b5, and if you play b5 you can take this pawn. And if they were to take, you would simply take the rook and win the game, since that would be a free rook. b4 is played, he plays a6, and here he plays rook a5. Now rook a5 is a really good move, and the point is, it's a concept of two weaknesses. In chess, there's such thing as a concept of two weaknesses if you want to win a game. You need to attack the opponent in two different areas. For example, let's say you're doing a boxing match and you keep going to the body. Your opponent will eventually block the body, right? That's not going to be a very good strategy. But if you go from the body to the head, now your opponent's going to be thinking in two different areas where they can't protect both. Now he plays a3 very simply because he knows his opponent's pieces are not very well placed. Now rook a7, and he takes the pawn. So this is a pawn he takes via tactic, which again is 50% of chess. If you take the rook, I take your other rook, and I will just be up a pawn. Now he attacks the queen. He simply brings the queen back. He brings the king into the game just to make it a little bit more safer and also guard these pawns. Now he plays a random move on the side of the board, not bad move, trying to open up the king, but it's not going to work here. We just play bishop e2. And a few moves later, black called it a day where the pawn was going up the board and there was nothing he could do to stop the promotion. Let's say black made a random move like rook a7. Here you just go rook c8. If bishop takes, you simply take the queen. And here you're up too much material. If you take the rook, I will take this. If you take the pawn, I will simply take the bishop and then take the rook. And white is winning. So you can see how this game demonstrated the idea of the weak pawn. Now that game showed us the idea of a weak pawn. And this game again will show us an idea of a weak pawn, but in a different circumstance. Now this is again a queen's gambit type opening. And it's leading us to a position where we're left with something we call the isolated queen's pawn. So in this position, both sides have castled, followed basic chess principles, but here white is left attacking a weakness, which is this isolated queen's pawn. As you can see here, black has three different pawn islands, and pawn islands are something that when the pawns are alone. So as you can see here, this pawn is all alone, these pawns are all alone, and these pawns are all alone. Here we have a position with the IQP. With the IQP, white wants to do two things. Well, first of all, they want to control the square in front of the IQP, and second of all, they want to win the IQP. Now, black has two plans as well. They want to attack the king, they want to keep as many pieces on the board, and they also want to push the IQP to alleviate their weakness. The pawn is a weakness because no other pawns can defend it and we can easily pile up on it. But the IQP can actually become a strength if black uses the neighboring files of the IQP to actually position their rooks and get an attack going on the king. But what we're going to try and do is trade all the pieces and win this endgame against this IQP. So let's see how it goes. So after bishop e6, we play the move a3, rook to d8, and here we play rook c1. Very simple move, putting the rook on a good square, where if you move the knight, you'd be attacking the queen. So the queen will have to move, the queen moves, and we play knight b5. Now this move simply does not just attack the queen. Of course you might think, oh, he's just doing it to attack the queen. Not really. He's doing it mainly to control the square in front of the IQP, because he doesn't want this isolated queen's pawn to push any further, so he wants to put a piece on that square. So the queen moves back and the knight goes directly where we want it to go. Now the bishop comes back just so we can further control this isolated queen's pawn square. He takes, we take with the queen, we trade, and after the trades, white is much better. Why is white much better? Because now there's less pieces to actually attack the king with, and if everything gets traded off, black will be left with this terrible pawn, and white will eventually win it and win the game. So we'll see how this game proceeded. h3, just creating some lift for the king. Rook goes back, a few more moves are played, and eventually you can see he's starting to put more pressure on this IQP. So he continues to ramp up the pressure, and eventually he trades some more pieces. And here he kind of uses the IQP as a bait to bring the queen back and now infiltrate on this rank to attack the king. So he used the IQP to attack it, but now he's using the IQP as a measure to actually attack the king. Here he takes a pawn, brings the queen in again, and here there's absolutely nothing black can do. He attacks the queen now, he also attacks the square, and there's no way black can do anything. If he moves the queen, we will simply give them a check and take this and win the game. So this would be really bad, and if he doesn't move the queen, well, we'll take the queen. So this is how we won, with the principles I shared about dealing with an IQP. In chess, there's many other middle game structures that can arise, and that's why learning chess structurally is so important, because yes, I covered 2 of them, but there is many more, but now you have an idea of how to actually play the middle game based on what's happening in the position. But now I want to move on to the most complex part of chess. The part of chess where it's like, oh my god, what is going on? Or if you're a beginner, you're like, oh wait, I kind of understand this, there's less pieces on the board. But if you're advanced, you're like, okay, no one knows what's going on. Magnus kind of knows what's going on, but he's the best player in the world. So let's go to the endgame. Jose Raul Capablanca is one of the best endgame players of all time. And today we're going to look at two of his games just to make sure you guys really understand of how to play the endgame. Well, we can see what's going on here. He has 3 pawns on this side, his opponent also has 3. He has 4 pawns on the queen side, his opponent also has 4. Now, he has a bishop, the opponent has a knight. Now, you might be wondering, what's better, a bishop or a knight? Well, they're about equal, but the bishop is very slightly better, especially when there's pawns on both sides of the board, since the bishop is a long-range piece. So the bishop would be slightly better in this case. Let's see how Capablanca handles this. Now, his opponent plays the very natural knight to f6. Now, he wants to put his knight in the center and get a really good knight. A good knight. You see what I did there? Okay, he plays king d2 and he plays king e3. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, why is he bringing his king closer? Shouldn't the king want to be safe? Well, in the endgame, everything switches. The king actually becomes a really good piece, and you use it to actually attack your opponent because there's nothing that can checkmate the king now because there's just no material left on the board. So you want to bring the king in to actually help your army. He brings the knight back, he brings the bishop back to d2. Now the king comes up, his king comes up. So the move h4 is a pretty good one, and it defends against g5 where he could eventually just take the pawn. Now his opponent plays g6 and he plays g4. Remember the checklist I said earlier, the 5-step rule? Well, some of those rules also apply in the endgame, where you want to look for pawn breaks and ways you can further get your pieces into the game. If the pawn takes, the bishop takes, and it gets further into the game, it can even travel on squares. Let's say the knight moves away, it can travel on this square, try and hunt down these pawns. But he doesn't take it. Okay, he eventually takes it. Now, see what Capablanca just did. He opened up the position again with a pawn break, not to recapture, but to position the bishop on d3 where it attacks a weakness. And if he wins this pawn, he can push this pawn down and win the game. Now, his opponent is playing very well. Now, you might think, wait, can he take this, and then push the pawn? Well, no. His opponent will push first and queen, so he can't do that. So he takes the pawn instead, and he takes the other pawn. Now, it looks like, okay, it's 4 versus 3. But this is really good for Capablanca, because he's got 3 and he's got 1 outside pass pawn, which is no longer a weakness like it was in the middle game, but now it's a strength, because this pawn has no real defenders, and it will just march down the board very easily with the help of the king as a bodyguard. Now, a few more moves are played, and you can see he's still hunting down the enemy pawns while promoting his own pawn with his king. And if you were to say which king is more active, it's clearly white's king, which is in the position, black's king is on the defensive. Now he plays the move a4, which is a really nice move, which prevents against threats of b5 and c4, where now if you play b5, I will simply take it. So you can see he's defending his opponent's plans and going for his own plans. So very well played. Brings the bishop back, brings the king in. He just wants to promote the pawn eventually. He's just finding a way through. Eventually, he brings his king all the way around, which he can because his opponent can't really stop him. He can't stop both these threats. So he eventually wins the pawns, and now he's going to win the game since his upper pawn. This is a very simple win. He's just got to find a breakthrough, and he finds it at the very end with king to a6. Now he takes. Now he simply pushes the pawn. You can't take the bishop because I'll queen. And the game is simply over. So you can see how well he handled that endgame. But now let's see a game by Capablanca where he's on the opposing end. He's got the knight and his opponent has the bishop. Let's see how this game goes on. So we're just fast forwarding through the moves right now. And in this position, he has the knight, his opponent has the bishop, and it's equal material. How is he going to win this game? Now, his opponent starts with the move g5. Now g5, he takes. He puts the knight on a good square. Now this knight is on what we call an outpost, and an outpost is a square which your opponent's pawns can't attack. If you remember from the game before, that weak square was also an outpost because no pawns could attack that piece. Now this is also an outpost and it's a great square for the knight. So the bishop drops back, and as you can see, this knight has continual pressure on this pawn. And in chess, you always want to be on the side that is applying the pressure rather than guarding the pressure. So already he's doing very, very well. So he pushes the pawn, a very nice move actually, not bringing the king in straight away, as eventually that might fall to some tricks with this move and taking the pawn. Also, this move stops any ideas and advancements of this h-pawn, where he will simply take it. If he didn't play that move, you could imagine a situation where his opponent gets these moves in and can start making his own pass pawn. Of course, he can't do that here because of this move, but you can see how this can get a bit dicey. And now his opponent does play h5, but it's too little too late. He'll take it, he'll bring the king up, and he can simply win the pawn. Plays the move f4, breaking up this pawn structure and making a pass pawn for him to push. Now his opponent makes a pass pawn for himself, but of course he has 2 pass pawns and 2 is better than 1. Brings the king in, brings the pawn up, stops his opponent's pawn, and eventually he gets to a position with 2 extra pawns and a very passive bishop, and actually in this position his opponent resigned the game. And why did he resign? Well, there's nothing much he could have done. In this position he can just push the pawn, let's say the king goes back, our knight comes in, our knight attacks the bishop and promotes, and we will simply win the game. Sample line could be this, let's say the bishop comes here, promote, take, we come back, we win the pawn, and eventually we will win the pawn and the game. Of course, just like the middle game, there's tons of different endgames with tons of different pieces. There's queen vs rook, there's queen vs rook and bishop, there's queen vs rook and bishop and knight, there's rooks vs rooks, there's rooks and pawns vs rooks, there's every single endgame you can imagine. Probably what I just said didn't even cover a fraction of how many endgames there are. There is tons, trust me. So learning all of them does require a lot of actual deliberate practice. And that's going to bring me to my final point. If you do want to take your chess to the next level, we do offer free classes every Wednesday covering a new concept each week, both beginner and intermediate concepts. And if you're really serious about improving your chess with a structured plan to become a real chess whiz, we've got you covered. We offer classes for beginners, intermediates, and advanced players. You can book a 5 or 10 week term with your class at the same time every week. Once you join a class, it's set. We use tests to track progress, keep an eye on each student, and give feedback at the end of the term of what we covered. So here's the best part. Ask your parents if you can join ReelChess. It shows you're smart, have great problem solving skills, and can think critically. Most importantly of all, you're great at the game of chess because you learned chess with ReelChess.